The Dane and Derek Show is an uncensored, unfiltered podcast. Content warnings can be found in the episode description. Hey everyone, welcome back to Dane and Derek. My name is Derek. I make movies and play a lot of tabletop games, and joining me as always is my good friend, Dane.
Hey, I'm Dane. I'm a writer. I love music and podcasts and tabletop RPGs. And I'm a prospective law student. But mostly, I'm a tabletop RPG person today. And by today, I mean while we're recording this episode.
You could say that you are in process of becoming a rules lawyer.
I accept your joke.
Okay.
I'm a little mad because it's both a very good pun. I didn't think of it, and I am not a pun person. Funnily enough,
totally misread the room.
No, you're good. You're good. It's funny. I'm probably going to steal it. It is.
Please steal it.
I will steal it. I just sometimes I just don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with puns sometimes.
Yeah. I've been surrounded by people who love to make puns as of late, to like a degree that it's like they don't even faze me when people make puns.
Yeah, I mean, you've always been kind of on the a punny person.
Yeah, you know? but now I've found people that are my match and beyond.
Oh, that's terrifying.
And it's every day. It's just, instead of every day I'm shuffling, it's every day I'm punnying. I don't know. It's bad. I don't know what to do. Like that's, I think, the first pun I've made in like 3 weeks, Dane. And that's because like I'm all punned out.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
These people sound scary.
Yeah. They're very powerful. I'll put it that way.
Powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, let's just start off right off the bat. The reason why I bring up rules lawyering is because the dungeon crawl is often associated with rules lawyering. And let's just get that out of the way. You don't have to be a rules lawyer or not a rules lawyer to enjoy a good dungeon crawl.
Fair enough. By the by, when you say rules lawyer, do you mean the sort of person who argues with the dungeon master to get their way? Okay. Because there's also people who are just sort of rule adherents.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, there are people that are like, the rules exist to create an experience. And then there are people that are like, the rules exist to serve me. I would put rules lawyers into that latter category.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, you definitely don't need to be a rules lawyer or even a rules adherent to enjoy a dungeon crawl. So I think we should start with like kind of like the history of like the dungeon crawl, which you and I have both played. You know, you've played AD&D, I've played OG and AD&D. The dungeon crawl kind of comes from like the origins of like D&D back when it was like still kind of growing out of like war games like chainmail and the like, wherein like the structure of campaigns, especially from like Gygaxian campaigns, would be basically there's like a home base of various kinds, and then you go into a mega dungeon, and the cycle of the game is of D&D would be you restock, you get all ready, you prepare, maybe you get a particular mission, maybe, and then you go back to the dungeon, you go as far as you can, but you do your best not to die, etc., and you come back out with treasure. And that's kind of like the origin of the dungeon crawl. And it's gotten a lot broader, I would say, to like dungeon crawling. I've heard used to describe basically any session of a D&D campaign where the primary thing you do is kind of adventure around in a subterranean, not even subterranean sometimes, just in a confined space on a map. Wherein the vast majority of things you'll interact with are hostile to you. Does that sound fair?
That sounds fair, yeah.
Yeah. Do you like dungeon crawls?
I do. So I would say that the kind of new wave of our TTRPG play styles that are very story focused, very character driven, very narrative driven, I would say that's fairly new to the genre.
I
and it's like newly popularized, I would say.
yes, I would say that it's that's all like a last 20 years thing.
Yeah.
It's of how popular it's become.
Yeah.
Because a dungeon crawl tends to interact more heavily with rules in general.
Yes.
Uh, because it's more combat, it's more traps and problems. It's I think a good dungeon crawl has a narrative purpose, and the dungeon itself is kind of an adventure, and it's not just a space in which to. It's not just like a playground in which the gameplay happens, and then
Yeah.
the story happens outside of it at its best. But I do think that narrative games like Dungeon World or Quest do not lend themselves that well to dungeons. In
No,
reality,
they don't.
um,
Like, like a good dungeon crawl is definitely like you aptly described it, right? You restock, you go back in, you go as far as you can until you can't, and then you come back out, right? The whole
yeah, or
point is to kind of stay alive long enough to get enough treasure to fund the next expedition back down into the dungeon.
right, or even in some cases level up because in
Exactly.
OG D&D, and I think I don't know about AD&D, I can't remember off the top of my head, but treasure counted XP, not killing monsters. Killing monsters only gave you a little bit, but treasure gave you tons more XP. So the
Yeah.
incentives were different.
Yeah,
But I
exactly.
dungeon crawling also is just like we're dealing with this sort of like fortified dungeon space. And I will say I think Dungeon World does better with dungeons when they are just narrative spaces. Like if you as the GM have like a map, it's not going to help you that much. It's
Yes.
better for you to have just a vague sense of what the space is and just tell the story together.
Yeah,
Um,
like
I,
yeah,
I
like every
think
other corridor is a fake corridor.
yeah, basically, and like I think um that the sort of like the narrative side of D&D has been there since the beginning. Like that's what D&D is it's people playing war games who wanted to tell stories with them,
Yeah.
right? Like that's what it is. So I do think that on some like they wanted to focus on specific characters which then led
Right.
towards specific stories.
Right.
So the thing I will say is that eventually this was always kind of like where it was going, and like the overworld started becoming more important, and all of these things like lead to tabletop role playing games as they are now. And I will say, personally, there are things I love about dungeon crawling. I
Mhm.
really like getting into the nitty gritty of like the gameplay and like, like it's a challenge. It's a different sort of challenge, but I really like doing it best when I really care about my characters and
Yes.
or I'm as the DM really care about the party and there's like a really big reason why they're doing such a dungeon
Yeah.
thing. Like I like that. I like when these things like overlap and combine. Like I like a really good campaign of a tabletop RPG to be able to encompass both. Um not one or the other basically. And like depending on the group, I will sit down with way more like dungeon crawly crunchy tabletop stuff or I'll be like no, we're going to play this like storytelling game because that's what we all really want to do.
Right.
And so like I will say I am often very critical of D&D 5e in particular, um, because I don't think any game is perfect. But also when something's as big as D as 5e and takes up so much of like the space, I like to be extra critical of it just to point out like, hey, there are other things. Um,
Yeah.
but one thing I do think 5e is very good at because it is kind of a nice like it's not as crunchy as some games. It's not as crunchy as like Pathfinder or um, oddly fourth edition or third edition of D&D or
Uh-huh.
advanced D&D
Yeah.
actually. Um, but it's also way crunchier than like Dungeon World or Quest by a
Yeah.
lot.
Mhm.
So I actually think it manages to sit in that balance quite nicely.
Yeah.
Um, where like yeah, you can go about and really dig into the rules. You can do multiple sessions where the whole thing is like all right, we're rolling investigations and perception checks. We're finding traps. We're solving puzzles, we're fighting these monsters, we're getting treasure, we're accomplishing our goals, and like, yeah, there's role playing and stuff, but like, this is not us like going to a social event, like,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think D&D definitely is really good at balancing those two elements of gameplay.
mhm.
Like there's enough skill structure to do like, okay, we're going to go infiltrate the debutante ball in disguise, just as much as there is, okay, we need to sneak past these monsters and oh, oops, now we got to fight them, right? Like
Yep.
there's enough skill overlap and rule overlap that'll enable both. And I think very often like dungeon crawling nowadays, I feel like often gets like put into this hole of you like dungeon crawling because you like to play D&D realistically, which I think is not necessarily true. Um,
Yeah.
and I think the thing about dungeon crawling is like what you were saying earlier about how you as a DM want to make sure that you're really invested in the party and you really resonate with them and you really want them to go through it and do a good job and survive, right? Like that element of it I think is like really important to a dungeon crawl because yeah, you're taking a character you really like and you're going to do something ridiculous that is unsafe, more unsafe than a lot of other things in the D&D world, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
All for the sake of like getting some artifact, getting some treasure, killing some monster, all that kind of stuff. That's like a very like simple mission. And I think something that I've talked about a lot with some other like DM friends of mine is that dungeon crawling enables you to make role playing decisions through your dice rolls and through your stats and through the actual mechanics of the game
Mhm.
versus more narrative moments of the game where you're making character decisions based on what you think your character would do as like a construction of traits and backstory.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's
Absolutely.
that difference that I think like, you know, there's you can really if you look at the game like through those lenses in terms of how to play the game, there are very different ways of playing that do have overlap, but usually like you find that the people that prefer more story based games are the people that love to come up with a backstory and love to come up with like, oh, my character believes in these things and this is where I'd like to see them go versus the folks that are like, this is my character, these are their values, but also they're here for like the ride, right? Like they don't their story is this campaign, right? And I
Yeah.
and that's a
Yeah.
very interesting bifurcation of like the types of players that you might play with when you're doing a dungeon crawl. And that can be very difficult, I think, to kind of balance is like when you have players that really want to solve puzzles and who really want to fight monsters and who really want to collect treasure mixed in with players who really just want to interact with other NPCs and stuff like that. It's very much a delicate balance.
Yeah, so there's two things. One, I think in this current era of D&D, the dungeon crawl, the crunchy side of it is a bit maligned.
Yeah,
Because I look at like Critical Role in particular as like, I think people think of that as like the only way and the best way.
yeah,
Um, and it's a great way, but it's neither of those things, right?
hmm,
It's neither the only way or the best way. It's just a way.
yeah,
And also there are some flaws with looking at actual play shows of any kind as a way to run your own home games because they are playing to an audience, which is not always what you want to do at home. Just saying,
correct.
like
Yeah,
it just isn't.
yeah. The show
Um,
changes because it's on a microphone designed to be engaging to listeners.
exactly. Yeah. Like sometimes, like in Critical Role in particular, like people will have conversations for like 10, 15 minutes between just two players. And at the table, I would never want that to happen
Yeah,
because like everyone at the Critical Role table is happy to, just like sit and enjoy and watch and all of this stuff because it's a show,
right.
right?
Hmm.
Whereas like at the home table, I'm like, you guys are just hogging the mic, guys. Like,
Yeah, you're
it,
hogging
there's
space.
there's three other people here who want to do something. Like,
Exactly.
so the interest, so there's that, which I think is just like a thing that kind of sucks, right? Like, I'm like,
Hmm.
like the dungeon crawl stuff is fun. Like, it's fun. It's fun to
Yeah,
fight monsters. Like, you put all this time into your build of like the character sheet side, and then you don't get to use it.
yeah,
Like, I'm
exactly.
not, And it also shoves out certain classes almost entirely.
Hmm.
Like if you play a fighter in a campaign that's like almost entirely social stuff, like God help you.
Oh, that's me every
Um,
campaign.
um, but the other thing to think about with dungeon crawling is that dungeon crawling also stems out of some old rules that have been like left to the wayside.
Yeah.
Um, so something that's I find interesting is that in OD&D and Advanced D&D, which is a lot of where the dungeon crawl like comes from, you are not incentivized to fight every monster.
Hmm.
That was a bad idea because back then your characters were not quite as strong. The monsters were stronger, and your goal was to get treasure and get out, or to accomplish a specific goal and get out.
Yeah.
Because you, unlike 5e, where you are incentivized to kill anything you can because it's how you get stronger. Um, you were encouraged to like negotiate with monsters and maybe scare them off or intimidate them. Like that wasn't like, oh, we missed a fight. It was, oh, nice, very clever. Now we've got 3 kobolds on our side because we promised them 100 gold each, and that's like nothing, like.
Hmm.
And so like there were social encounters in dungeons. Like there was this other side of it, and also there were rules around light and random encounters. It was much more like, have you ever played the game Darkest Dungeon?
No, but I've seen art promos for it.
Yeah, so in that game, like you're managing light and stress and like all of this stuff, and it's like hard because your characters very easily could die in that game, and that's straight from the like OG stuff, wherein
Mm.
like part of the tension of the dungeon crawl is you are not guaranteed to get out. You are not guaranteed to run into a nice balanced encounter for you. You are not you need to make sure that you're lit. There's a light source. You need to make sure that like your torches don't run down. In original D&D at least, there were rules for taking turns in dungeons. You
Hmm.
would get 10-minute turns um
Yeah.
during your dungeon crawl, which was very different. And I don't know if I would love that playing that. I've never actually played that way properly. It sounds like maybe a step too far in the crunch, but I kind of see how that works, you know. And it also explains why certain spells are like 10 minutes long or 1 minute. It explains some stuff, which is interesting. But it ratcheted up the tension of going into the dungeon. When the dungeon is 90% of the game, it's okay for it to be a bigger investment. Also, it was just a more flexible idea, right? Like now we have like this like dichotomy between either we're doing like the role playing or we're doing the dungeon stuff. And like the in those days, like it was just like, no, it's all the same. This is just where we are because that's where the adventure is.
Hmm.
I also think the dungeon crawling works a lot better if you're not your characters aren't that important, if that makes sense. I don't know if that quite
Yeah.
tracks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, um, well, yeah, because like the likelihood of your character dying is pretty high. So
Yeah.
not being so attached to like your character and their backstory and like them succeeding in whatever mission they have set forth, because in a lot of ways, right, like D&D, the story's supposed to be generative through the rolling, right?
It's supposed
Not
to be generative at the table. Yeah.
Yeah, not generated through like players coming up with backstory or dungeon masters coming up with plot points to hit.
Yeah.
And I think that's where like I think an actual play show really kind of messes with the formula, because on an actual play show there are specific things that players want to do and specific things the game master wants to do to make the narrative interesting,
Mm-hmm.
versus
For
just
an
kind of,
audience.
yeah, exactly, for an audience. That way the audience can follow it a little bit easier, versus just like, like someone rolling a 1 and that results in something bad happening, and that bad thing informs how their character acts the next time you play, right? Like
Right. Right.
that, you don't really get that on like a lot of modern examples of um tabletop game play. But yeah, I think the other thing with the dungeon crawling too is just that it can be seen as being highly technical when in
Mm-hmm.
reality it's not, it doesn't have to be, right? Like you brought up
No.
that point about negotiating with monsters. That's like a great way to interject some of that narrative story character gameplay into a dungeon crawl, right?
Right. Or like, um, and even like old modules, typically there's in almost every old module I've ever seen, there's at least one friendly NPC somewhere in the dungeon,
Yeah.
typically under the captive of some evil thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's not devoid of that. And typically, like, enemies aren't, unless they're truly like monstrous, unless it's like a fucking owl bear or something, it's not assumed that you're immediately going to be attacked, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so like it's very interesting in this sense of like I have found in recent campaigns that I've played in and run that a lot of people will create these characters who have something to do. They have like this backstory, but then they stop being adventurers at some point.
Yeah.
Like they're characters who kind of like a Bilbo Baggins, if you know what I mean. Like they'll go on an adventure, but they're not an adventurer, if that makes sense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it kind of hard to run a long-term campaign that is not super tied in with everybody's backstories. Because if it's not, the characters are not motivated to do anything. Um, and so like that's kind of part of what I mean about like the characters not being so important in the sense of like and so like for this next game that I'm running, I kind of straight up asked both of my players. I was like, "Hey, we can do fun backstories and stuff, but the adventure is whatever happens, right? And like
Yeah.
I need you to be playing characters who want to go adventuring.
Yeah.
Um, like don't play Bilbo, play Geralt, please.
Yeah.
Like play a person who is going to continue to go out because it's what they do. You
Yeah.
know, like
Yes.
and that's something that I've kind of been like craving more is like I want to go on adventures. I want to do stuff. Like I don't want to just like play surprise gotcha with your backstory, you
Yeah.
know? Of when did I introduce it and what's happening over here. Like I want to do adventures that are not necessarily related to the characters.
Right.
You know, like if you hear about an interesting thing, I want you to be playing people who want to go to that thing regardless. Um, and so it's very different, right? And I like both, but I'm definitely in the mood for one over the other right now. I'll
Mm-hmm.
be honest. Um, so yeah, and like you said, it doesn't have to be a huge mechanical thing, right? Like like for a good dungeon crawl, I think that the DM does need a map and you need to do a lot more like specific prep in a way, but also you don't have to. You can go get a module and they're great. There are so
Yeah.
many out there that are like both done by Wizards of the Coast, which if you're doing online, I would recommend. I got the Roll20 thing and they put all the maps and stuff up there for me automatically. And I was like, this is dope.
Oh, that's really cool. I didn't
Oh
know
yeah, you
that.
can go on like you could go and buy like Tomb of Horrors right now for
Oh.
5e. And
Huh.
it'll just like, and here's the map, and all of the little tokens are put in, and they have their little hit points sitting above them. Like I'm like, this is great.
Wow.
Yeah, like it's super cool. And then there are like also like tons of like really cool little zines that are like, here's an adventure that works for 3 4e, uh, all basically that work for basically anything you want. We kind of like put some vague stat blocks in, and maybe you need to beef it up if it's 5th edition, or maybe you need to like cut out what a bonus action is if you're doing original D&D, like um and so like you can do that, and it doesn't have to be like huge weight on you as a dungeon master. But also like it's up to you if you want to track food. It's up to you if you want to track light. You
Right.
know,
Mm-hmm.
I, like you can make it as intense or not as you would like, and also like there's all kinds of tricks you can pull. Like, okay, I hope my players aren't listening. I don't think they listen to this show, so I think I'm okay to say this right now. I'm having basically all the hit points of almost every monster in all the modules I'm running, unless they're named, unless they have
Oh.
like a name, like If this dragon has a name, it gets full hit points. If it doesn't, no. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, because what I want is I want for to reach the point at which something interesting happens, where either one group feels like they need to run away, or um, the victory happens faster. Um, because the last thing I want is to slog through endless fights.
That's really smart.
Because 5e kind of does that because the hit
Yeah.
points can get so high. Um, so I was like, yeah, why not just like cut most of the hit points in half? And like at the early levels, that means like every goblin has like 2 hit points. So they're going to die in one hit. But you know what that also does? It does lend towards like the Lord of the Rings style of like in the films, like they're just like cutting through stuff, right? It's not that those things aren't
Yeah.
threatening because they can still hit the players, right?
Right. They still deal
Especially in
full
high numbers.
damage.
One of the best mechanics from fourth edition that I'm sad is gone is the minions.
Minions. I was gonna
Fucking
say,
minions, so
yeah.
good. Like in
Yeah.
fourth edition, there were different classifications of monsters because it was like we're doing an MMO, but on paper, and we're all like, okay. But one thing that was great is there was a classification of monster that was called a minion, and it only ever had one hit point, no matter how
Yeah.
much damage or its armor class ever was. Um, and it was so cool because then you could just like throw a sea of them at you at the players, and like if you had like a wizard or something, they could fireball and destroy like 20 of them, and that was the expectation. um and so like I'm kind of bringing that back, and it's cool. Like I'm
Hmm.
really appreciative of that. um but yeah, and part of that also has to do with I only have 2 players, so like I do need to kind of like lower the difficulty a little or they'll die, like just
Right.
die, and you know,
Yeah.
action economy and 5e and all that. But so yeah, like you don't need to, it doesn't need to be this like crazy thing for you as a GM. You can make it way easier on yourself.
Hmm.
um because like I think the crucial thing that makes a dungeon crawl is that it's mechanically driven, and it's like you said, it's generative.
Yeah.
um the story happens in that moment, right?
Yeah.
um and that's cool. It's really cool. Because you start getting like wild stories. Like one, I remember a time you guys, and this was during the Lich campaign. Um, you guys were like on like a bunch of pillars. Like you had to jump from pillar to pillar in this room, and there were flying enemies. It was a dick move on my part. I'll admit. Like you guys were mad.
I loved that encounter though.
Yeah. And then I think I can't remember whose paladin it was. They fell. And you, Derek, you're like, you know what I do?
Yeah.
I'm going to shoot him with an arrow tied to a rope.
It wasn't. The party wizard
Oh, it was the party
fell. The
wizard,
party.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
After several misfires of like spells that hurt like Ryan's character, I think we were all angry at each other and all angry at the encounter. And yeah, I just shot. I shot the
Just
party
to save
wizard
him.
through. Yeah.
Yeah.
I dealt a lot of damage, but
He was knocked unconscious.
yeah.
But he was hanging from there. And like I think about that whole scenario, and I was like, that is a very interesting moment.
Yeah.
And that would never have happened if we were just like strictly playing character, because like basically you were all like, we don't want him to die,
Yeah.
like we don't want him to die, and if he falls he dies, we got to figure out a way to save him. But like partially this is a problem of fourth edition being like so combat focused, is like you were all like, we don't really have any utility with which to save him.
Nope. Like,
um Especially because he was the wizard. He was kind of
yeah.
our only sort of utility person. So you're
Yeah.
like, I guess I will save him with an attack,
Yeah.
and like that's funny. I actually ended up stealing that to save Nathan, or maybe it was Robert
Oh,
from
that's
death.
awesome.
Yeah, because I was playing an archer, and I was like, yeah, I bet Will Cordell will let me do this. He'll think it's funny enough.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so like it's these moments can't really happen if you're locked into like these other things, right? And the way to think about a dungeon crawl is I think about it as a contained sandbox. Set it
Mm.
up as a place for your players to go play in, you
Yeah.
know, where you don't have any like don't have any like opinions on the outcome, right? Like if they have to go running away from this dungeon and then they come back 3 levels later and just tear it apart, let it happen. Don't worry about balancing your encounters. Like, because that's awesome. That's an awesome story for them that they got like completely routed and then like they come back and they're just like, we're gonna fuck your day up now, thanks. Like, that's fun. That's fun for players.
Yeah.
I would also advocate for saying fuck you to balance in encounters and games in general.
Yeah, I think I understand why it exists, and I know you do too. But at the same time, what makes these games great is the fear of failure,
Yeah.
because it forces you to think on your toes in a completely different mindset. Because you're now not just thinking about, oh, I just need to get through these encounters to get to the end. It's, oh, I could die. I need
Yeah.
to do everything I can not to die. And that's a completely different mindset when playing these games. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive to like dungeon crawls or narrative games. That feeling does not have to be mutually exclusive. And I think that's what we're trying to hone in on here, is that the dungeon crawl can be so much more than what it's chalked up to be these days.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be this endless slog of like, and then you go down a 5 foot by 5 foot hallway and then enter a room. Do you turn left or right? Like, it does not have to be that.
Yeah.
Um, and like, sometimes people get really into it. Like, and also, I also sometimes think about like overland, like sneaky dungeon crawls. Like, do you remember the campaign I ran for you? I think it was your dad and Nelson and Jason, where I set you guys in like a weird sort of like
Oh, like a purgatory-esque world.
purgatory sort of thing where it was like a very contained space, but you guys
Yeah.
could go anywhere you wanted in it from the jump.
Right.
And like I did not balance any encounters at all.
Yeah,
I just
yeah.
vaguely had it from easier from where I like dumped you out to way difficult at the end. And
Yeah.
like in between, it was like, if you want to skip to the end, you go right ahead. You'll get killed, but like you go right ahead. Like I remember that game being particularly fun, and that was just a very extended dungeon crawl,
Yeah.
even though you were not actually in a dungeon.
Mhm.
And I remember lots of fun stuff in those moments. Like there was the moment that I think it was Jason and Nelson figured out the code for cracking magic, and that was awesome. You
Yes.
fought with a shovel half the game, at least half the game, maybe
Y-
more.
yeah, pretty much, because I think like by like the because it was a 3 session game, and
Yeah.
by the end of session 1 it was pretty clear every time my character picked up a sword, I'd roll a 1.
Yep.
So I started using a shovel because I crit like twice with a shovel.
Yeah, so you stuck with the shovel until like I think near the end you picked up like a magic weapon that started working for you, but like yeah, there was just a ton of like great moments like that.
Yeah, the
And
moment where we were fighting that knight in the arena and I used that
mhm.
necklace that summons like an angel.
Yep, yep, there was that.
Yep.
That was a good one. That was
Yeah.
definitely a really good one.
Yeah, it was fun. That was a fun like 3-part game. Like, this will kind of bleed into next week's episode,
Mhm.
which little teaser here. Um but like that extended dungeon crawl was basically a one shot. And I think that's also something really interesting about dungeon crawls, is like they're really great for that kind of a game.
Yeah, I will say a dungeon crawl is a good option for a one shot. Because it doesn't require a ton of character work for your players. It's the sort of thing, like a good dungeon crawl, you could pre-gen all the characters for your players and then just like let them all pick. Um,
Yeah.
and a dungeon crawl also lets you contain the space in which you are dealing with. Like, and in that way, you can be like, okay, well, they're not going to go anywhere else out of here, so I can basically think that we could deal with this in a night.
Yeah.
It is another way to do that. But yeah, I guess before we go, I'll just say unbalance your encounters. It's fun. It's weird. Like don't be out to like kill your players, but like it's called Dungeons and Dragons. Let them run into a dragon early. It's fun. It's neat.
Yeah.
And they're gonna deal with it super differently than normal, right? Like if you hand them a dragon when you've been balancing every encounter, they're gonna be like, yeah, we can just kill this because I'm level 15 and they've given me a 15 challenge rating combat. But like if they're level 2 and you're like, this is an ancient red dragon, they're gonna do wild shit to stay alive. Like
Yeah.
they're gonna be like, I supplicate before the dragon and pledge my loyalty. Like
Yeah.
they're
And
gonna
that
do
becomes an
stuff like
interesting thing.
right, and like do that. Make your dungeon crawls like alive. Like think of your dungeon as like a living place full of like interesting, weird things that are on the whole very threatening, so that they get to use their cool powers and do stuff. But it's not a place that is devoid of them making role playing choices or character choices. You know, that's all I got. It's not all I've got, but we have to end an episode eventually.
We do. Yeah. Well, with that, you can follow the show at Dane and Derek everywhere, and you can see what movies I'm watching on letterboxd.com/Benig-Aiello. And there's also links to my work there.
You can find what I'm doing over at danewrites.com, DANEWRITES.com. There's a link to my Substack where you can find a selection of poetry and fiction that I write, and some nonfiction, actually. And then links to my old podcast and links to music I've composed in the past. I think there's still a link to my Twitter there. Not that that's really relevant. I don't know why I keep saying that, but I felt like it. So here we are.
Yep, here we are. Thank you all for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next week.
Catch you later.